Hi, everybody. You all warm enough? It's very warm up here. I'm going to be talking about community, but I'm going to show you a little film clip first of all. And community is something we talk quite a bit about in Woodlands, and quite a few of us live in community houses. You might be aware there's 12 or 13 community houses that are functioning as part of the kind of group around Woodlands and Love Bristol down into Stokes Croft, and about 150 or so people living in community. And we quite often talk about community, but actually the word community and our understanding of it isn't just limited to a few people living in houses, but it is a very much a kingdom concept that we passionately believe is key to understanding how we're meant to live in the 21st century. So when we're going to read a Bible passage in a little while, and I just want you to be aware again that when we read the New Testament isn't a list of things that the writer of the New Testament are trying to get us to do, and in order to be part of God's kingdom. It is an understanding of what has happened to the world in the advent of Jesus, in the coming of Jesus, and the facts and the reality of what is alive and abroad in the world as we live and seek to follow Jesus, that we're in a kingdom that has come. Jesus is really clear about it. It's at hand. So when we read these passages that call something out of us, that feel like calling something out of us to be more, be aware too that they're really just describing reality. This is the reality that you're living in, and you can either cooperate with it or you can ignore it. But if you want in, then all you have to do is understand that this is part of being the follower of Jesus. So the first thing we're going to do, though, is watch a film clip. And some of you will be aware that an amazing lady died last week called Maya Angelou. Who's heard of her? Wow, lots of you. She was an incredible civil rights activist who was born in the 1930s in Arkansas in a time of deep racial hatred and a time of real... it was just a very unhappy childhood. She was brought up until she was about 7 with her mum, and then when she was 7, her mother's boyfriend raped her. And she spoke about it only to her brother, and he told people, and not long afterwards the man turned up dead. And Maya Angelou, believing that her words had actually caused this man's death, stopped speaking for 5 years. And eventually, a woman came alongside her and started to encourage her to speak, and got out of Maya Angelou this voice. And she became a poet as she got older, and a play director, and a writer, an incredible genius writer, and a civil rights activist. She was the first black woman bus conductor in New York, and she went on to do some extraordinary things. She was 86 and she died last week. But one of the things that really comes through so powerfully in the things that she wrote and spoke about is this sense of not being a victim, but of having, from her journey from pain and suffering through to wholeness and freedom, and adopting this really strong faith of her grandmother, she began to realize just the great truth that underpinned her life, that God loved her, could set her free, and that also there was no one that was an alien to her, no one that was an enemy to her, even though she was a victim of great hurt and pain. So I just want you to listen to a few words by her. And these words really have come out of her at the end of her life, something that she learned and she wanted to communicate. So let's have a look at that first. The reason why I played that was I was just looking through some of the things that she said and wrote about last week and thinking that Maya Angelou, really, she had discovered that out of that journey of pain and suffering, she discovered really that the pursuit of life and happiness and the pursuit of God is a community event. It is a community pursuit, and it can't be done alone. And although however painful and difficult relationships are, we can't get away from it. It's in the sort of soil and grit of relationships and the difficulties and the joys of community that we actually really find true life. And in fact, you know, when Jesus was approached, being asked, what can I do to inherit eternal life? He said, didn't he? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. And I feel that is something that just really encapsulates the truth that Christianity, our faith, our journey with God is not a solitary pursuit. It's not the pursuit of how can I find my destiny? How can I find my purpose? How can I find what will satisfy me? How can I become more complete? And in my relationship with God, try and feed on him. Actually, it's really clear from the New Testament, there's this constant flow down from heaven, up to heaven, and outwards into the communities and back again. And that's life. And if we want to go where the life is, if we want life like Jesus was holding out to us, then we will find ourselves in community, for good and for ill. We will find ourselves in relationships that hurt and relationships that give us joy, and we can't get away from it. So that's why we always talk about community. And I thought, actually I spoke about community about 6 months ago, and I thought I'm not going to just repeat what I said then. So that's part one, and if you're interested, it was back in September last year, and you can listen to that. And in that time, we looked at how the supernatural community that was birthed in the book of Acts sprung into life. And it was a power-filled community, sacrificial, and a community of people who'd overcome their fear, and they were overcomers. And because of that, they sort of spread out around the globe with this sort of burst of energy. But I thought today I would just talk about some of the things that I have learned living in community in the last 10 years. Not because that's the only way to live, but because living in a community house with 18 people and bringing up your family in front of other adults who have never brought up children and don't know how hard it is, and showing yourself who you are in a public way 24/7, it's almost like a sort of little microcosm of what it could be like in a broader sense, and you just learn loads of things. And I thought I'd just distill a few things that I think are core to understanding how we're meant to be living, because I really believe that in community, in a spirit-filled, maintained and led community, is great power and something that the world desperately needs to have. And I often think that what we have as standard, natural and normal New Testament Christianity is what the world is desperate for. I was thinking about it a few weeks ago when we came to a wedding here, and it was just a fantastic wedding. And afterwards I was thinking, these weddings here, they're a bit Hollywood. They kind of look amazing and everyone seems happy and they dance down the aisle. And I thought sometimes it feels like the sorts of things you see on Hollywood films, we've got them just here. They're trying to recreate something in Hollywood, in films, that we just have as standard. This is natural, because actually in the life of the community, a life touched by God and a community touched by God, there is genuine opportunity for joy and peace and freedom and hope for the future. So I think we've just got a lot we've got a lot that we have that without really knowing it. So I'm just going to read a few verses from Ephesians 4. And again, I just want to say this to you. This is a call from Paul to live in a certain way, but he's also explaining that this is what it's like for us. This is our reality. So let's have a look at it. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and the teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up till we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Paul was saying that it's possible to attain to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. And I really believe that in this age, in our time, in this church, in our communities, it is possible to attain the measure, the full measure of the fullness of Christ, and actually to become mature. And a mature community of people who are following Jesus will have the measure of that fullness. And what does that mean? What is the fullness of Christ? You know, it is all that Jesus was on the earth. So his wisdom, his power, his teaching, his goodness, his mercy, his sacrificial love, his tenderness, his beauty, his truth, his righteousness, his straightness, his passion, his power, all of those things, beautiful Jesus. Paul is saying that it is possible for our community as it matures to attain to the full measure of that. That's an extraordinary calling, isn't it? And I think first of all, we're called to grow up. So one of the versions of that in Ephesians 4 says this: grow up and know the whole truth and tell it in love. And Paul describes a loving culture that is grown up enough to speak the truth and to tell it in love. And I wonder, just to ask you, where are you most authentic and real and honest in your life? And who are you most authentic and real and honest with? Because actually, if we are to become mature, to grow up, and to be able to speak the truth in love, then there's going to have to be a place where we can be authentic and real and honest. And where we can receive feedback that will tell us how we're doing. And where we are going to need to create and maintain a culture where people are safe to speak to us about how we're doing, and where we are safe to speak to others about how we're doing. When we've hurt people, for us to be able to receive that and hear it from people. And when other people are hurting and we need to give them feedback. How safe do you feel in the communities that you're in to give that kind of honest feedback? Because actually, we will not grow up unless we learn how to do that. I've talked a few times about our fun evenings that we have in our community house where we give feedback on what am I like to live with. And those evenings, a few people who've lived with us sort of grimacing around the room, but those evenings, they sort of come every now and again, not too often because it's a bit nervy. And, a bit of tension around the tea table just before, particularly for the people who were on the spot that night. What am I like to live with? And we've had people coming and, it's been their night and we've told them a few things. They've got some feedback and they've run out of the room crying and run back in the room saying, tell me some more. And we've had evenings of real laughter, and we've had evenings when people have been totally shocked to hear that everyone's noticed they never wash up. And they genuinely thought they were getting away with it. And actually what we do in those evenings, we say to people that you get to hear, first of all, what you're like to live with, both good and bad. So, and they're amazing evenings, actually, because they're revelatory, because that you get feedback on what your blind spots are like, don't you, Pete? He's grinning over there. What your blind spots are like. And, you know, you need that feedback because you can't see your blind spots, do you? And we need to create cultures where we can hear what we're really like. I was having a chat with somebody in the house the other day, and she was saying, but I don't really want to know what I'm like. I don't want to know the bad stuff because I'll feel so bad. And I could sympathize with her because it's horrible, isn't it? Getting some feedback on the kind of what you're like, and that sinking feeling. What do you mean everyone out there thinks I'm like this? And I was saying to her that the thing is that if people are thinking stuff about you, if their experience of you is not all positive, they're thinking it anyway. And in your relationship with them, that thing will be there. And to you it might be hidden. You may think it's hidden, but that will affect your relationship with people. And actually, one of the outcomes of hidden stuff in relationships, hidden tensions and difficulties where people don't feel free to feedback and say how the experience of you is. One of the problems with that is that people tend to put up barriers and withdraw. And, you know, the call of our communities, the call that Jesus gives us in our communities is to be united, do everything we can to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And the Spirit of God is continually at work in you to connect you to people. Are you aware of that? Whoever you're talking to, in our communities and out in the world, people you've got relationships with, he is a reconciler and a connector, and he's always at work to try and connect you in positive ways. But the spirit of division, the opposite spirit, is constantly at work to try and separate and divide. And so anything that in a relationship we are unable to receive and hear and deal with authentically, openly and honestly will divide and cause disconnection. And we'll move and drift away from this possibility, this amazing community possibility that is absolutely within our grasp, Paul says in Ephesians, that it's possible to attain to the measure of the fullness of Christ. And I think that we need to sort of be intent on preserving and encouraging that culture of unity and honesty and authenticity, because we want to be the community that attains to the measure of the fullness of Christ, not just for our own sake, but because this city needs that. This city needs to see communities dotted around the city where there's this authentic spirit that deals with stuff that comes up in a peaceful, loving way, because it's powerful. And power flows, the power of God freely flows where there's a community of loving Christians who are able to honour each other. And so there's an ideal, there's something that we could go for, that we could try and attain, that kind of sense of authentic relationships. And I just leave you with that point that, you know, who is it that you're most authentic and real with? And have you got those kind of relationships going on in your life? And if you haven't, then make a decision to find a community, to do your utmost to find a community where you connect with people in that way. And do it because there's a call on your life not to be mediocre and not to be bound by small things, but to live a large life that is not constricted by stuff that never gets dealt with. So there's something to go for. Another thing to go for is keeping the unity of the Spirit. And the way that we've got to do that is we need a culture of grace. We need to have a strong intention in our hearts and minds that we will give grace to others when they mess up. And that's one thing that you just really learn living in community, that it's one thing to come to pastorate and put on your best face and serve the coffee and look good. But, in community life, you realise that half the people who are behaving very, very well at pastorate come home and they never lift a finger. And there's that sense of, living the 24/7 life that our mess is on display. And when our mess is on display, we need to be people who are secure enough in ourselves to not be knocked off balance. And actually, one of the great challenges for us in living in community is to be secure and stable around other people as they unravel. And for them to be the same as I unravel. And it is true to say as a leader that it's interesting living as a leader in a community, because there is sometimes this sense that you're supposed to sort of do it better than everyone else, but actually everyone, all the 60-odd people that have lived with us over the last 10 years, some of them very odd, they'll tell you that we're very normal, very ordinary, and that actually things come out in community living that we don't really want to be showing particularly. But actually that authenticity is really important, and creating a space where and giving grace to each other and honouring each other. Danny Silk of Bethel Church calls it keeping your love on. Whenever people around you, whatever they are like, how are we able to maintain our own sense of love and honour to other people so that whatever they are doing, that we maintain this connection to the Father and we keep our love on. In a Jesus community, we learn how to handle other people's mess and how to manage our own responses. And that's a real call on us to manage our own responses to other people's mess. But being aware that spirit of division wants to take other people's mess, and use it to separate us from each other. We have this thing we say DTO. We say it all the time, DTO. DTO stands for don't take offence. It's like a rule in our house that you're not really allowed to take offence. And I'd just say to you, why do you keep it in your family life? It is really powerful, because actually as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we're not really meant to be taking offence ever, or holding offence against each other. The call to forgive for Christians is pretty much compulsory. And hard though that is, it is one of the most powerful tenets of the Christian faith, is that we are called to be forgivers and called to create a culture of grace around us. The practice of forgiveness as a way of life is essential. And it's nowhere is it more appropriate than in community. I was reading in Deuteronomy the other day that this verse, listen to this. This is God's community. This is the Old Testament community before Jesus had demonstrated how to forgive in the power of the Spirit. This is God's community. Every 7th year, you shall grant a remission of debts. Don't be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your needy neighbour. You shall rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. That's what God's community looks like, a remission of debts, a continuous remission of debts. So we need to be practicing that, practicing reconciliation, practicing forgiveness, practicing grace, practicing honour, a culture of goodness and honour. Because the Spirit of God is always at work. It says in Corinthians that he is at work reconciling the world to himself. And, if he is at work reconciling the world to himself, then we are called to join in with that great reconciliation work. And actually living in community is an action, a reconciliation action. It is to live in community with each other lovingly. It's like mounting a resistance to the spirit of the age, which is constantly drifting towards isolation. Topshop recently did a survey of their biggest demographic, this sort of post-1981 babes, and they surveyed them and did a survey of their kind of lifestyle choices and how they felt about things. And they were so shocked at the results that they redid the survey, because the survey came back with this overwhelming picture of loneliness. overwhelming picture of loneliness and unhappiness and disengagement from people and spending vast amounts of time on the internet. And they were shocked enough to redo the survey. The spirit of the age is drifting towards isolation. And whenever you see the enemy at work, the enemy of your soul who wants to take you out and keep you isolated, you will find isolation. But whenever the Spirit of God is at work in you and through you, you'll find reconciliation. Are you up for being a reconciler? For some of you, you are living with unforgiveness. You're living with relationships that are unresolved and unreconciled. And there is a call on us to consider forgiving again and to stay forgiving. Martin Luther King said, forgiveness isn't just an act that you do every now and again, it's a permanent attitude. That needs to be ingrained into who we are. And finally, I've been thinking a lot about what Jesus said when he said, greater love has no man than this, than that he laid down his life for his friends. And one of the things that living in community means is that we will occasionally be called to do things that we don't feel like doing or want to do. And they will feel very much like dying. And recently, there's something like that has happened in our lives where there's been a sense of, we didn't choose this, we didn't want this to happen, but here we are, and I've got a choice, really, whether I preserve myself, preserve my time, preserve my freedom, or I go with this thing that we feel we're being called to do. And, you know, when I've talked to people about it, sometimes it feels like we feel like we've almost got a right to have a great blessing instantly whenever we do anything good, whenever we do something sacrificial. But actually, I think in Jesus' call, when he said those words, when he said, greater love has no man than this, than that he laid down his life for his friends, there isn't any sense in that of, this is how you get the blessing, by the way. If you just do this, then there'll be a payback. Actually, as followers of Jesus, we are called to live with our highest loyalty for him, regardless of what the outcome is. And maybe the outcome won't always be instant gratification. Maybe my destiny won't suddenly come into focus and I'll feel fantastic. Maybe sometimes this community that we're part of, we're called to just literally lay down our lives for our friends. And you know, a lot of us will lay down our lives. We'll lay down our lives for our families quite quickly. But it's interesting that Jesus said friends and not families. It's like one further out, isn't it? Another layer further out. We'll lay down our lives, some of us, but we'll be home by tea time and we'll have them well and truly back in our hands again. And sometimes the call will be to lay down our lives and to literally lay them down permanently. And for people who are captivated by Jesus and who he is, the beautiful Jesus, the more in focus he is, the less of a sacrifice it will be. I suppose I'm hoping that my son Joe, when he sees in Mozambique the stark reality of what it's like to be a follower of Jesus when there's absolutely nothing, that he will be so captivated, he will be changed forever by that experience. But sometimes living in community means that kind of sacrifice. It means laying down your life and not counting, not weighing up what we'll get back. I've been to a wedding this afternoon in Birmingham, and it was an amazing wedding. It was a wedding in a Christian rehab, and it was the wedding of somebody who came to stay with us for a weekend about 5 years ago. And he had been sleeping on the ground in Cabot Circus as he was an alcoholic. And a friend of ours asked us if we put him up for the weekend. He was on the way to this rehab, this Christian rehab. And during that weekend, he came to Woody's on Sunday night. And he came to Woody's, and when he came back home, he said to us, I don't know what it is that you've got, but I want it. And he asked us to explain what was it that he experienced when he sat amongst you and he heard the worship and he felt that sense of something else, something otherworldly. And we explained about Jesus, and there in our living room on that Sunday night, he prayed and he asked Jesus to come into his life and to change him. In the morning, we sat at breakfast with him and he said, well, I've made some friends here in Bristol that I didn't expect to make, but I have met the greatest friend of all amongst you. And he went off to the rehab. That was 5 years ago. He's one of the young leaders there now, and he married a woman there today who he had met. And it was just a beautiful moment. It was in the gardens of this rehab under an oak tree where they pledged their love to each other, whole, happy, free people who had come and experienced the community of God and had moved on into that rehab community, which is an amazing community, Battelle in Birmingham, and experienced the community of God, the remission of debts, the culture of grace and forgiveness, the honouring of people who are totally lost and broken and messed up, that honouring and calling out of them real life. And those two people have made a commitment to each other which will bring amazing fruit. It was just an amazing ending to a bit of a journey, I suppose, I've been on recently. And I've just felt that it is time, I suppose, for us to call each other again to that kind of lifestyle that is not just about, am I getting my needs met? Even my need for worship, or my need for a good experience with God, or my need for to serve God in a satisfying way, but actually the call to serve and love Jesus and our loyalty to outweigh everything else. And because in that, in living in that way, then we will be naturally, normally, a community that has got something the whole world wants to have. And I have no doubt about that if they knew what we have as natural and standard, they would want it. And our call is to be it, and to be it in all the fullness that it can be. So just to finish, practical things. Why don't you, if you are somebody who, when I mentioned about the unforgiveness thing, had a little bit of a ping, there's a relationship that is not sorted, that I need to do some forgiving, don't miss the opportunity, because as long as you withhold your forgiveness, you are separating yourself from the community of God and the communion of the Spirit. So don't waste time holding back forgiveness. It's a hard thing to do, forgiveness is. I'm not minimizing it, but I'm saying it's a call for all of us. But for others, you have possibly failed to really see that your journey is a community journey. It's not just about you getting your needs met for blessing and strength and inspiration. But God is calling you today to recognize that your connection to this body and to the body of Christians around you, and actually to take a moment to say, God, how am I connecting and being reconciled to people around me? How am I living the life of reconciliation? How am I serving? How am I living in your community? When Joe goes to Mozambique on Tuesday, he is going to experience that most extraordinary thing. He will arrive in a country where many people won't speak English, and yet he will have and experience the spark of the Spirit in others, the same Spirit that lives in him, that unites us. And he will worship alongside them and experience the power of God coming through them to him and from him to them, even though language might separate them. And it is an amazing thing, the community of God. It's a beautiful thing, something to celebrate and something to really live for and go for.